Alrighty, Keaton. Today, I'm not going to finish putting your engine together, mostly because I'm lazy. Alright, so what happens is your rocker box covers here, they're just really grody looking and shit, and I need to get a Scotch-Brite wheel for my buffer. And to be honest with you, I just don't feel like sitting in front of a polishing wheel tonight. So that's not going to happen. So today we're going to put your forks together. You know, forks are something that I bet you if you did a poll, less than 1% of the people that work on their motorcycles have ever taken their forks apart. They act like there's like magic in there, but they're really simple and straightforward. And when I show you how to do this, you'll say, WTF, over. Anyway, let me get set up and I'll start explaining to you what all this stuff is. So in general, in the motorcycle world, we have two different types of forks. In reality, all you need is two pieces of pipe like on a bicycle. It's just to make it so you can steer the motorcycle. But we like to have some suspension to smooth the ride out. This type of fork is called a telescoping hydraulic fork, all right? And it's also of the style called a damping rod fork. That's a damping rod. On my bike, that's what you got. Same kind of forks, mine's just all covered up with shit. However, my forks, I've taken all the internals out and put what's called a cartridge system in. It gives a lot better ride, all right? The other type of fork you're gonna see on motorcycles commonly is a Springer fork. So the Springer fork, the springs take up the shock, but there's not really much going on there other than that. They're really kind of pieces of shit, but old farts like me like to put them on because we think they look cool. All right? So let me set this up so I can kind of explain to you what all this shit is. Hang in there. To start out, I'm just going to identify all the parts in the fork, all right? So this part here is your upper fork tube. That's a part that bolts onto the motorcycle, all right? This is your lower fork tube. That's the part that your wheel bolts to. Right? The upper fork tube also is hollow. Ooh, you can see right through it, right? Inside the upper fork tube will be the damping rod, the fork spring, damping rod cup, and oil. All right? So let's talk about each one of these parts here real quick. Like I'm sure you're tired of hearing me say, but mechanical stuff is just simple, logical shit. There's no magic. Like I said, people won't go into their forks. They think there's like voodoos and magic monkeys live in there. So let's try and demystify this, okay? Hang on. Well, fuck. Stay there. All right, so let's try and just start talking about the parts from the bottom of the bike up, all right? So this is a lower fork tube, all right? So here's where your axle goes through, and it sits down like this, and your wheel mounts on here, right? You also have what's called bosses, okay? You got two bosses to mount your disc brake to. And then you have these two bosses here are for your fender, all right? The second major component is the upper fork tube here, all right? On the upper fork tube, we have a few components. This here is just a dust cap. We're putting gaiters on your bike so it won't go back on. Then this piece here, let me see if I can get a better angle. Move a bunch of shit. This piece here is just a dust cover, all right? This little clip right here, grab this one over here. This little clip, can you see it? Is what holds the entire fork together, keeps it from coming apart. That's what your life depends on, all right? The next thing down on the fork leg is what's called the oil seal, all right? Your forks are full of oil, and this keeps the oil from just shooting out, all right? You got a spacer here. These two items are called bushings. They're actually what ride between the surface of the lower fork tube and the upper fork tube. They make that connection, all right? Alrighty. Again, it's hollow. Ooh, it's hollow. And inside there are the fork internal components and the spring, all right? So next is your fork spring, all right? So your fork spring is designed to be able to handle a certain amount of weight and compress a certain amount of distance. These are what's called straight rate springs. You can get dual rate springs that get tighter as you compress them more, have a little bit more flexibility when they're just moving a little bit. But for your bike, it's a very simple suspension system. You just have these single rate springs. Now the length of the spring determines how high the motorcycle sets in the forks. So you have an 883H, which means it's a hugger, which means it has a lowered front end. And the way they make the front end lower is they just simply put a shorter spring in. It's that easy, all right? This here is called the damping rod, all right? So basically the way it works is when your fork goes down, it forces oil through these holes. These oils have resistance to the oil flowing, so it slows down that action. If you didn't have any oil, any kind of compression or rebound control, then you just go boing, 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 boing down the road. So this is what actually gives you the plush ride. The springs absorb all the shock, all right? These just make the ride plush. This spring here is called a top-out spring. So when you compress your bike like that and the spring pushes the fork back up, this thing bottoms out and compresses, and instead of going clunk, clunk, there's some resistance there or some cushion there, all right? Damping rod. This here is just a cup. It goes on the bottom of the damping rod when you mount it into the fork, all right? This here is just the cap. It goes on the top of the fork tube and locks everything up. There's an O-ring on it for it to seal. Those are the major components. Well, there's this screw. This holds the damping rod and the bottom of the fork together. It goes in the bottom of the fork tube like that, all right? So anytime you take apart a set of forks, there's always something, there's things you always want to change. Now these bushings that I showed you here, they're not necessary to change them. I looked at them, they're not worn. The bike doesn't have that many miles, there's no reason to replace them. But if you remembered me talking about this oil seal right here, this holds all the oil in the forks so your oil doesn't seep out and make a mess. Always replace it with new fork seals, all right? This screw that holds the bottom of the damping rod in has what's called a crush washer on it. It's a little, where the hell's the camera? Over there. It's a little copper bronze washer, and it works as a gasket, as a seal. So you always want to replace those with new ones. Then you got fork oil. You always want, dumbass. You always want to replace your fork oil because the other stuff is gone. And I went down to rush hour traffic and bought this stuff for you, and you know how much I love traffic. All right? Let's talk about putting this together, and I'll be back. The assembly of your forks is really pretty straightforward. Like we said, we always change this oil seal, right? So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to slide that up off the top, and I'm going to put a fresh one on it. Now it is an oil seal, and it does actually have a lip. So what you want to do is, like, you know, everything else we were talking about, I want to lube up that fork tube before I slide that on so I don't damage it. All right, pretty easy and straightforward. I'm going to do that, but I'm not going to video it, and we'll go from there. All right, so I've cleaned up the fork tube a little bit. There's a little rust up here. Took a little bit of Scotch-Brite. You want to make sure not to make scratches running this direction. If you make them a little bit this way, it's not as bad. So I have the new fork seal on. I have the spacer, and the bushings are there, okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to install the damper rod into the fork tube. And it's pretty simple. You take this, cram it in the end, tip it up, and it comes out the other end. All right? So this cup here is kind of unique. It goes on the end of the damper rod, and it's part of how it mounts up. This will be mounting up right here in the bottom of the lower fork tube. The weird thing is, when I took all your parts to get powder coated, I accidentally sort of like slipped one in, and now it's black. So all we do is I'm going to put that on there, and I'll come back to you in a minute. Alrighty, so I got the dampening rod and the fork tube now. I got the cap on it, the pretty powder coated one, and I have my lower fork tube. Now, because we just had this powder coated, they use a bunch of sandblasting material to clean it up, and it gets down inside. So I actually took it up in my kitchen, and I have some detail brushes, and I use good soapy water and clean that bore out. You don't want it to become an abrasive. So all we do is take this here, the upper fork tube, insert it into the lower fork tube, and drive it home. All right. Now, you don't need really many special tools to do this job. It's pretty simple, but because Harley sucks ass, even back in 1993, they have one metric screw on it, and it's this one here. And that's because these forks are actually made by Showa in Japan, all right? So to make it easy, I have a long shank hex bit. All I'm gonna do is, so one real quick thing is this is the old screw, right? And this is a new one. So don't just assume when you buy hardware that you got the right one, all right? Because, you know, the Harley guys can make a mistake just like anybody else. So always, you know, compare the two, and they're right. All right, check that out. So now all I do is stick this in here and get it started on that damping rod. So because there's no really anything for me to get purchase on to like hold it while I tighten this in, there's a couple little tricks. Now, it's just screwing into that threaded slot, right? So when I screw it in there, it's gonna twist. So what I do is I pull back on the fork tube, and that creates a little bit of friction. And I can get this damping rod to a certain point. And I can feel the fork tube pulling in, so I know it's actually working. Now when I get to the end, like a lot of things, there's a torque rating for this bolt, all right? And because it has that washer on the end is, why do I hold things so high? That washer on the end is also a seal. You need to make sure you have at least enough torque. And it's not easy to do. One way is to get the fork spring and get it in and get it all put together and tighten down, but it's easier if you have Mr. Impact Wrench. So hang on and let me get set up for that. I've got the seal pushed in as far as I can, and now I need to drive it the rest of the way home. You can buy a seal driver for about 50 bucks, but it's a different one for every different size of fork you have. So I have another trick I'm going to use, and it involves electrical tape. Stand by. So what I've done is I've built up a ridge of electrical tape here. Usually the seal tool fits over the shaft like this and pushes on the face of this seal and pushes it in. I'm going to use the electrical tape to do it. All right, so I have the electrical tape there. I have the seal in there. All I do is go kerpowie. And it's seated. Now all I do is I put this clip in place into the slotted groove in there, and that's what holds your forks together, and they don't come apart. So the clip's in place there. It's in the little grooves. It's a lot like that circlip that we had on the piston wrist pin. All right, basically the forks are together. They're not going to come apart. Now all I have to do is peel the tape off and clean up whatever the glue is. Now this is the first time you've ever seen that. You haven't worked on forks, so you're just sitting there going, yeah, okay, that's pretty cool. But I'll guarantee you, anybody who's ever fought putting fork seals in and bought a seal pusher and tried everything else, they're going to see this and go, that's fucking genius. And it is. All right, we got one of your fork legs put together. The next thing to do is we have to add oil and the spring and then put the fork cap on. And that fork cap can be a bitch to get on. Easiest way to do this is slide it into the motorcycle and clamp it in and go from there. So that's what I'm going to do. Last thing to do is get the fork oil and the spring in. So the easiest way to do that is mount the fork in the bike. And look up online. I found out that for the 883H it takes 12 ounces of oil. Sometimes it's measured in height from the top of the tube. So in this case it's just 12 ounces. Because I'm not as dumb as I used to be, which is pretty damn dumb. I put some oil in here just to see if we have any massive leaks to start with. So I'm just using, you know, fork oil from Harley. And it's a 16-ounce bottle. And on the side it's got little marks. And so I'm going to pour oil in until I have 4 ounces left. Hang on. All right, as you see, I've got the fork spring in the fork. Now what I do, this is the bitch part too, because you have to take this bad boy right here and push down and compress the hell out of that spring and get it started, right? I can't do that because once I put this cap on, I can't get the forks out of the triple clamps. And A, I have to paint the triple clamps, and B, we're putting gaiters on your bike, so I'll have to pull the forks out, put the gaiters on, and put it all back together. But in general, that's how you build up a set of forks. It's not very complicated at all, but a lot of people don't like to do it. All right, Miss Keaton, hope you enjoyed this. If not, oh well.